that circular way of processing time and attributing. I mean, yes, it's like doing fall through was something I've wanted to, like, it allowed me to think and talk and explore a lot of, what was a huge chunk and a very transformative central chunk of my life for so many years. But I'm simply just not interested in telling that story as it happens in the real world. But I find that fiction is more useful in terms of being able to kind of circle back around and revisit things and sort of pick out what is relevant, what I do associate with something else, and be able to just kind of like helicopter little elements out and plop them into a fictional world, or, patch them on to other characters. And I find it's a much healthier and more interesting and more fun way to kind of process a lot of the stuff that shaped us.
Were you ever a journal person? Do you have anything that you can kind of consult from? You were, okay.
And for fall through, I actually, I used to be a true journal devotee from about 1995 to probably like 2013 or 2014. And a lot of it is like parenthood just kind of like made it so that I'm like, oh, I haven't written a single thing about my life in 3 months. And it doesn't matter. It's like, it was one of those things where like, one of the best things about parenthood is how stuff that doesn't matter that much just instantly melted away. I'm like, oh, I don't have bandwidth for that kind of stuff anymore. So basically, like, all of my writing and all my thumbnailing still happens in the same like black cover sketchbooks that I've been using for most of my life. But it might be like when I start a new one, I'll try for a couple of days to like just, do free writing to be like, to catch myself up for posterity with what's going on in life. And then it like, I feel like I don't need journaling in that way anymore. And as a cartoonist, I kind of feel like that may be a spot where I've finally leveled up, where I'm like, I'm putting enough of my own thoughts and feelings and working it out on the page whenever I do my fiction, and it's actually not that necessary. I definitely I journaled more as I was doing what became Save It for Later, but a lot of that was simply because I really did need to process a lot of what was happening during that authoritarian power grab, and then very quickly I realized that this is something that's going to shape into something that is going to have an output. So that was sort of a hybrid in many ways.
Those dates line up like kind of 1-to-1 with Soophie Nun Squad, it seems like. So this was kind of a rich vein for you to go back and read those experiences.
Without a doubt. I feel like I used to be like, I was the band parent in Soophie Nun Squad in most of my bands, except my final band, where the drummer was actually like more organized and more connected to the rest of the scene than me. And it was nice to kind of be like, I just yell and play bass. But yeah, with Soophie, it's interesting that I've finally reached a point where I can no longer remember like the exact dates and the exact bill of every show that we played, which used to be like a point of pride. And now it just no longer matters as much. But like the long process of doing this definitely had to do with assembling and reassembling these increasingly streamlined lists of key moments and incidents, which planted some kind of seed or resulted in some kind of larger realization about this little world that I grew up in and through, and to just kind of let them sit for long enough until I figured out whether or not they actually had a place in this fictional story.
You describing yourself as the band parent doesn't surprise me at all. Like, that tracks with what I know about you. And, you've obviously, written about your brother a bit. I wonder how much of that kind of ability to come in and not run things, but to oversee things and to make sure that everybody's okay is a product of growing up with your brother.
Well, that's an interesting point you bring up, because especially the older I get, the more I realize that like that's where my, self-centered youthful vision of what I want to do with my life as an 18 to 27-year-old or whatever, made me, less reliable as a family member and as a brother, but also somebody who didn't really, I was still too immature and self-centered to really understand that I could play a role. A lot of that changed in 1999 when I started working professionally with people with developmental disabilities. And then like that was one of the largest changes in my entire life, was recognizing that I can, put all this work into this as a career and as a way of life. And what I've learned from living, with my brother and with my family is something to extend outward. But also, even more importantly, finally, I was ready to be a better brother. And my, just learning and understanding more about the autism spectrum and developmental disabilities really helped me kind of finally become the brother that was closer to, the brother that I would rather be.
What was the initial impetus for taking that job?
Well, actually, like I had never thought about doing a job that wasn't, food service work or whatever. Like for me, and this is like in those first few years of Soophie and Squad touring and recording and playing shows and coming up with like increasingly more elaborate ideas for the band, where Soophie was the central organizational force in my life for many years. However, so like I was home for the summer, getting ready for a couple of tours that summer, working at a pizza place. And one of my brother's old high school friends came over to visit, who I remembered from the early 90s. It was always just this nice, cool guy. And it was basically like, Nate, I want to talk to you about something because I've been doing work for adults with developmental disabilities. And I think you would do really well in this line of work. And there's a performing arts and visual arts center for adults with developmental disabilities here in town. You should go apply for a job there. And as it is with a lot of things, like it took this old friend of my brother actually saying the words. And all of a sudden I was like, wait a minute, I can do that with my time. And basically like from that job, then I moved into increasingly more, moved more into individuals' private lives, like from day programs, fine arts centers and stuff into group homes, and then into private residences, into job coaching and all kinds of stuff. But a lot of it was like, I just simply had no idea that there was work that wasn't shit work. It wasn't like service industry work. To me, it was just like getting by. And so that was, I was also like, I was 20 or 21 years old. So it just never occurred to me that I could spend my time at a job doing something meaningful and also do meaningful things in the rest of my life.
This isn't a direct parallel, but I recently.
You might want to back up a few seconds. You're
oh, sorry. Yeah. For some reason, I'm just going to turn my camera off. Hopefully that'll help. But I'm convinced that I'm getting FiOS next week, and I'm convinced that Spectrum knows that and is throttling my internet in the meantime. I think that our politics are fairly similar on most issues, and I had kind of a similar moment recently where, I feel like I've, preached this certain amount of compassion and empathy, but wasn't really living up to that from the standpoint of like, I'm not doing like volunteer work. And so toward the end of last year, I started volunteering. There's a food pantry where I am in Queens, like a couple blocks away. And it was that thing of like, I don't know why didn't I do this, 6 months or 2 years ago? And I think for me, part of it was this, I love it, by the way. And part of it was this worry that it was going to be sort of like depressing, that this is my free time and it's going to be a bummer, but it turns out to be incredibly rewarding.
You bet. I'm glad you made that step. And like a lot, and I don't know, a lot of it is really just the way we make assumptions of how we would spend time that we're not spending or that we're spending in a different way. And it's just nice that, we can always surprise ourselves and be like, oh, I was just wrong about how I would handle this situation or what I would get out of it or how much it would or wouldn't take away from other parts of my life. Those are like the actual times of growth where you're like, oh, I was wrong about that or whatever.
You described the process of working on this book as to a certain extent, processing some of those emotions in a similar way that your previous book was about the current moment. And I'm wondering how much of your connection or recognition of this notion of art as therapy, in a sense, came from that experience of working with those people.
Let me think. I don't, well, I think you could make the argument that yes, but this is something that's like a real kind of like slow burn, slow crawl, creative evolution that might go all the way back to, the kinds of changes in perspective and sort of my re-education process. And by that, I don't mean that in like a totalitarian communist way, but like my post-collegiate working as a professional, reading and, reading up on my field, and working with people with disabilities during the period of time where I was writing and drawing Swallow Me Whole, which was, I was trying hard and I succeeded in it not being directly influenced or inspired by the people who I worked with at the time. However, yes, that was sort of the major theme of those mid 2000s years while I was working on that first graphic novel. Simply like so much of my awareness was shifting and expanding, but developmental disabilities were becoming a new center of my life. And I feel like to change, I don't know, like I feel like as my path in doing my solo work continued, the next big shift was Come Again, actually. It was this where I sort of leveled up by like leaning more into genre and being comfortable with it, embracing it, but recognizing that like, okay, now, like I'm a new parent, like I've sort of like left the full immersion into the punk underground, and I've been like embraced and accepted in this new, very similar creative community of indie comics, and that feels great. But a lot of the questions and reflections that I was working out about changing ideals and changing the ways our lives change and all of that being okay, a lot of that got worked out in the book Come Again. And so once I finished that, I was like, oh, this is the strength of fiction for me, like as I hopefully grow to become a better writer so that I can actually like rise to this challenge. Again, with the exception of Save It for Later, this is really proof of concept that I can work all this stuff out on the page and it doesn't seem like this navel gazing thing that is all about me working out my stuff on the page. And in fact, like that's not unique. That's the role of fiction much of the time. So I think, when I jumped into doing Fall Through, I was very much of that mindset. But at the same time, once I had most of the story written out and worked out, except for like surprises that popped up along the way, that's when the world shut down. And so there are then these extra layers, not only like this part of this era of my life that I was no longer as closely connected to, but then realizing as I was beginning to draw the book, how much of the world inside Fall Through revolved around this other thing that had been yanked away from all of us, which was just people breathing on each other and sweating on each other and touching in
Screaming.
close quarters. Yeah, and like being invited into strangers' basements in a non-creepy way to like go listen to people yell their hearts out. And so yeah, for in a lot of ways, especially just like physical proximity and physical contact. And you can really see it on the page. Like I started getting into just like mixing up white ink every day, and there are just like thousands and thousands of droplets of sweat and breath droplets throughout the book. That is my pandemic therapy process on the page. And it just really allowed me to kind of like, people are afraid they overuse these kinds of terms, but people they still haven't unpacked their pandemic baggage. Like, yes, it allowed me to mourn the loss of those spaces and the loss of that way of relating to other human beings. And if it weren't for drawing Fall Through, it would have been much more difficult to get through 2020 and 2021 before there was some kind of return to that kind of intimacy.
On the flip side, Save It for Later must have been very difficult in some ways, because there's a sense in which you were almost kind of wallowing in the world falling apart in real time.
And like Save It for Later, process-wise, was absolutely nothing like any book I've ever done before, and probably never again. Basically, like by the end of 2017, I recognized that I had all of these moments and these changes that had happened in my private life or in my family's life, stuff that's now documented in the pages of the book. But the impetus for turning it into something was recognizing that these were not unique experiences to my family necessarily. That, in fact, just 1 year into the previous regime, people had kind of bottled up and like, whether it's people being like, oh, we didn't have enough bandwidth for talking about like the personal aspect of what living under this authoritarian power grab is like, or what it's doing to our kids or to us as parents or adults or neighbors or whatever, but recognizing that people were already kind of shutting up and normalizing it. And so my idea was actually to make this book as quickly as I possibly could. I wanted it to be like 96 pages and finish it in 6 months. And I remember like talking with my agent about it at Mocha in 2018. And then I went back to my hotel room or something, and I wrote the first 40 pages of it just in one sitting. And I was like, I may actually draw this book in 6 months. And thankfully, that I also evolved past that. But it was very much a real-time creative process, because once I really got rolling, then I had to acknowledge just how constant the upheaval and the chaos was, and recognizing that when your kids are growing, like I started that book when my older kid was 5, and then finished it when they were almost 8 years old. And, or maybe they were 8, but like so much can change in 3 years or 2.5 years along the way. And so, it was a very different kind of like truncation and acceleration of time for that book.
Time passes differently when monitoring children. It's really easy to lose a decade, and then you see somebody's kid who you haven't seen in 10 years, and you realize like exactly how much time that is.
Without a doubt. And the fact that, and this, to tie this sort of back into the sci-fi and like scientific theory in Fall Through, it's funny that especially when you're encountering other like friends and acquaintances who are also parents, and it's like you've both been in these bubble universes, or you've both been living these separate lives at different quantum speeds. And so it's hard, like everything seems normal to you with how you've experienced your life. And either you feel like sometimes you get this feeling like, oh, this old friend of mine has changed so much, or be like, oh, their life must be pretty stagnant. Nothing's really going on. When that's never the case. It's like the same always applies to you when someone else is seeing you for the first time in forever, is that sense that, that you yourself are the constant in terms of like the way time passes and the way you flow through the world. But just like some major relativity business going on.
That was an unexpected element, I will say. And there's a lot in this book that I think you're probably just a little bit older than me, but there's a lot in this book that I really related to on a personal level growing up in the East Bay. And, we had like Lookout out there. Yes. And went to Gilman, and then I went to school in Santa Cruz, and we would put on house shows. But there's I don't know if this is an aside, or maybe this ties back into sort of the sci-fi mystical element of the book, but the story of her coming to town and trying to find William Burroughs was something like that I found so deeply relatable.
I hear you. Well, what's wild is not only is the setup for all of that true, not for me specifically, but in terms of like the American punk community, William Burroughs, until he died, like from the late 70s or early 80s until his death in 95 or 96, lived outside of Lawrence, Kansas, and was known to just at random, infrequently, just appear at underground shows. But famously, one of the first punk venues in the American expanse was this kind of like outhouse in the middle, like on the edge of a cornfield outside of Lawrence. Is a real place. Chris Stein writes some really great stuff in a bunch of his photography books about going and playing at the outhouse, or just visiting in the outhouse, even like in the 80s, recuperating there through his illness. But bandmates in Soophie Nun Squad, like we had a whole Kansas City contingent who went to Kansas City Art Institute in the mid 90s. And sort of a major thing was like, oh yeah, I was at this 24-hour diner, the Jayhawk, last night. And at like 3:30 a.m., who shows up but William Burroughs? And he's like, 80 years old. And then, hearing just this is where like the other theme of just the way that the mythologizing of a community's history happens very organically. And it's rooted in these actually crazy occurrences and coincidences. But in order to turn it into a story that is woven into the larger subculture or whatever, eventually it gets a little flattened, a little simplified, gets mythologized and heroized. I wanted to put Burroughs in there also because he probably killed his wife, and he's pretty messed up dude. So like,
for the people who don't know, they were playing a game of, he called it William Tell, and he shot his wife.
Yeah. So like he has many very, very sketchy marks against him. And I enjoy just sort of like the hero worship, and the sort of like idealistic vision that Diana, who's one of the dueling main characters, has regarding what she feels is Burroughs' creative role as it relates to her. And so she's able to ignore all of these things because she sees like the opportunity to be in the same physical space as him for one time only as something that has like cosmic significance. And it makes absolutely no sense to anyone else. And yet it's what an entire leg of a tour was booked around the 1 in a million chance that Burroughs would actually show up at the show.
In terms of this, getting back to this idea of processing in real time, I'm wondering if a book like this, that again is tied to a very specific moment in time, and that's tied to a very specific part of your life, whether to a certain extent it was necessary to have distance to write this.
Without a doubt. I think like the earliest seeds, the one, like when I tried to actually write something that was more of a personal reflection, that was like back in 2007, right? Like a year after Soophie Nun Squad was defunct. And then, the timeline of this is over a decade in the making. Like in 2013, I created the band Diamond Mine, for what became Come Again, which I was just writing at the time. And
that's a decade ago.
Yeah. And so like, I knew they were Arkansas's fictional first punk band. And that led me down a bunch of rabbit holes that relate to Fall Through entirely, but each one is quite a long journey. But basically like from there to actually realizing that it was okay to finally open up the luggage, not the baggage, but the luggage that had a lot of experiences that I had in and with bands and as part of my hometown scene. It was probably a good 6 or 7 years before I was like, I think all of this is one book. And I feel like that happens a lot. I'll get, a strong, specific idea that's the big idea for some book. And I'll start kind of like working with it and waiting for characters to emerge. And then I'll have some other idea, and it'll take, 2 or 3 years before I realize that both of those ideas are the same book. And so I had to merge several ideas over the course of several years before I realized they were all pieces of the same puzzle.
At the same time, was it clear? Because again, this was such a formative time for you, and and it is the kind of thing that I think does need to be preserved, because there are so many elements of this that just don't exist in society anymore. I was thinking today I got an ad on Instagram or Facebook for an igloo thermos, or like an igloo container branded with Dookie on it.
Oh,
like a
wow.
Green Day Dookie igloo. And I was just thinking about how, when Green Day signed to a major, that they were not allowed in Gilman anymore. And that was this big deal. And just how much society and this idea of things like selling out has just completely, for better and for worse, kind of evaporated in the meantime.
Yes, without a doubt. And like, what's funny is like, there are a lot of touchstones like that I like. There are some that I intentionally avoided because I thought they were, well, really, it's like, I wanted to make this a short book, or short for me. And so I was like, there are some things that I didn't bring up at all that were so instrumental in the forging of this era. Like the release of Nevermind plays no role and is never mentioned but yet it was this huge catalyst. And sort of like, the second wave of that was when Dookie came out, was sort of like pushed the anti-corporate DIY underground even further underground, and sort of started the process of us eating our own, which has an extra layer of meaning for us in Little Rock, because Green Day, the full touring version of Green Day for many years was 40% people from Little Rock. And like Jason White, the other guy in Green Day, the second guitar player.
Guitarist, yeah.
Yeah, he was in Chino Horde and many other bands in Little Rock. So like the opening quote to the book Fall Through is a quote from Chino Horde. And so it was a very weird dynamic to be locally, just so proud of our friends and like the kids who are a couple years older than us, who started finding their place across the country, and then like settling into this wild success and staying humble and staying great. But sort of coupling that with this larger, like seething tension and reactionary attitude across the world of punk, but America in particular. And a lot of it was like youthful posturing and stuff. And the good thing is that I think, like, virtually all of that melted away, and people realize how, like, what nonsense so much of it was. And a lot of it's because, like, you just have this like very incorrect, inflated idea of what any degree of success means. But even, like 10 years later, it was really like sad and frustrating that like on Soophie's last tour, we played some shows with Against Me, and that was right before they signed to a major label. It was like in 2006, but they were already getting their tires slashed at every show in America just because they went from No Idea Records to Fat Records, which is still an independent label.
That's the No Effects Guys label. It's not even like Epitaph.
Yeah, it's like those were like really crucial moments that were like sort of marking these generational shifts, but also marking the weakness and the vulnerability of being such a part of a creative subculture that's really like defined and maintained by 16 to 24-year-olds. And recognizing that you don't have to play by a 16-year-old's rules anymore once you realize that these are rules set by teenagers, perhaps in another decade.
This is an important point, and this is something that I think about quite a bit. How much of growing up and, becoming an adult is the process of, in therapy, they call them core beliefs. Like they tell you to re-examine your core beliefs. How much of it is that process of realizing what things you were holding on to were in some cases arbitrary and in some cases actually perhaps harmful?
Without a doubt. And I'd say like as it relates to punk, like one of the other themes that I have Jody, the main character and narrator, that I have Jody ruminate on is her realization that punk is essentially just what is left over that has not been rejected yet at any point in time. And that's like, it's always like a rolling notion of rejection. And so whatever is not rejected in a moment falls under the banner of punk. But the ways in which I feel like that still hits me every once in a while. And to me, it's intertwined with more of like a, Generation X. Like I'm still technically tail end of Generation X, but like a Generation X, Xennial, dinosaur idea of like, as you mentioned a few minutes ago, like the notion of not selling out as an overriding ethos. That is its own ends that justifies whatever needs to be done to not sell out, even if that's an undefinable thing. But yeah, like I feel like a lot of it is just like requires constant kind of reevaluation of like, recognizing when you have an immediate instinctive distaste for something and sort of questioning what it is inside you that's actually finding like such an aversion to a decision or the way that something might look or appear from the outside. It's strange.
I don't mean to discount punk ethos at all, because I think a lot of that was very foundational for me. And I'm sure that there are things that I've carried with me into adulthood that stem from that time in my life. For you, how central of a role did punk play in forming your picture of the world and your political outlook?
I'd say what actually gave me a social conscience and sort of exploded my concept of power and inequality and stuff it was Chris Claremont's X-Men and thrash metal, like just prior to punk. But like basically Anthrax and X-Men together really kicked the door open. Prior to that, as documented in my book, Any Empire, I had the fortune as a child of having like my dad was a career Air Force dude, but was very cautionary about my G.I. Joe kid leanings towards like this cartoony notion of
the military industrial complex.
Yes. But like the conversations we would have even in childhood were very eye opening and sort of made me ready. He was also my Sunday school teacher. So like when heavy metal kicked in, along with like Days of Future Past, that's really when things got set on a certain course. And punk, which would be the next year, 8th grade, punk, I think its largest contribution at the time for changing my worldview was more on the micro than the macro, because I kind of already knew what was going on for me, and in my limited 13-year-old way, what I was interested in fighting against and fighting for. But punk allowed me to see that there were other young people in my town who were also doing their own thing, and that all of these interests overlapped with each other already. So I was recognizing that like there's already this like whisper network of teenagers who are writing and drawing and yelling about stuff, and they're already meeting right now at like a hidden place in a park to yell about all this stuff and pass around their zines and sell their tapes and stuff. A lot of it was recognizing that I never cared that it was me and 3 or 4 of my friends. I didn't feel alone, but it was in recognizing that like, oh, you're definitely not alone. There is something that has already been in motion that is really made as a haven for this type of, concerned, creative, bored, pissed off, kind of person.
I often talk about this idea of sort of like finding your freaks, and obviously really different now on the internet, but, there was that feeling when we were growing up and coming of age before that, where, maybe you felt like an outcast, and you thought there weren't other people that thought the way you did and liked the things you did. And then stumbling into that group is just such a empowering and transformative experience.
Without a doubt. And especially like I have 2 kids now who are tweens, and, they are now connected in limited ways, through devices to their friends. And it's been like a learning experience to recognize that like, oh, when they play Roblox, which to the non-parents, that's this like incredibly strange and kind of awesome, open-ended video game platform where people like build levels on their own and like set
it's
up. It's
kind of like Minecraft.
Yeah. It's weird. And like at first, like the alarm bells really went off, but recognizing soon enough, I'm like, oh, they're actually hanging out with their real friends through this medium. And they're having social engagement and making real connections and being creative. And so like, it is interesting to like, by placing the story in Fall Through in 1994, not only was that like the pivotal year of my youth, though I was like a 16-year-old in 94. So I was a punk generation younger than Diamond Mine are in the book when they're going on tour. But like a lot of my books, they are often placed in settings in which I still don't have to worry about cell phones and the internet. And like I knew going into this book initially, like I was going to have this band continue to be from 1979. And I was like, okay, so for this story, I want it to be closer to my era so that we have this kind of like hardcore network that would have started around 79 or 80. So I'm like, what if I make it take place in the mid 80s? And it's like at the end of Diamond Mine's long tenure as a band. And I was like, I still don't really connect with that very much. And this is where I wind up reverse engineering important parts of the plot in order to work around the limitations. Like I painted myself into a corner by having this band appear and come again in 1979. And they didn't really make sense in the setting. And that was the point. They're like playing at a farmer's market in the Ozarks at 10 in the morning. They look like these maladjusted hippies, jocks, cowboys, and like roller skaters. And that's the way Arkansas punk is kind of, because we're Arkansas. But I was like, okay, they don't fit in their time. But I was like, why don't I just make the whole deal that they don't fit even within their world of misfits? So I'm like, why don't I just plop them down in 1994 and I will figure out what makes sense about the fact that they don't make sense, like the lack of internal logic by their existence. And I was able to kind of build up from that. So I rooted them so that, like, yeah, they really do exist in 94. They just don't fit for the time. And then I go from there and I'm like, oh, it's because I've already like flattened my idea of what punk was, even in my own era. Of course they fit. Like, not everybody at the time was just like looking like they were from the pages of Maximum Rock and Roll or Heart Attack. But yeah, there's a lot of like problem solving and reverse engineering that kind of helped me stay in a sweet spot so that I still didn't have to worry about certain kinds of connection, contact, technology. I know I'm running out of get out of jail free cards about that at some point. But, you know, we'll see how long it's going to take before I have to have an internet connection in one of my books.
You're definitely brushing right up against that in the time frame that this book was set up. Yeah, this is one of those realizations that I had recently, and in hindsight, it's really obvious. But I read Penny Rimbaud's book, The Last of the Hippies. Have you read that?
No, I haven't. I've read the Crass book.
Yeah, which is great.
But I haven't read The Last of the Hippies.
Yeah, it's this. Yeah, I think it's PM Press, like the Crass book, and it is really what it is an extended version of the liner notes from the first Crass record, and it's discussing. Can't remember the guy's name, but it's discussing this hippie who was friends with Penny, who threw on this, and he put on this annual like event at Stonehenge every year. It's the first time I really recall seeing somebody who is, about as punk as you can get, being in Crass, acknowledging how closely the punk movement was tied to the hippies and how it sprung out of that. Because, like, there's this idea that punks hate hippies. The Dead Milkmen were big pushers of that concept.
And it's funny that like. I don't know, like reading I'm trying to remember the exact title of the Crass book that I read. It has an orange cover.
Is it Story of Crass?
The Story of Crass, yeah. So like, I was so fascinated by that book, and it was so heartening and validating because, yeah, in exactly the same way that you were saying, so much of the book was basically like bluntly being like, I personally have never been an anarchist. Like, I identify with a kind of like, democratic socialism. We were hippies. We lived, yes, Dial House is a commune that is still alive and kicking today. But yeah, like the pre-Crass, pre-punk art band Exit that I think played those festivals you're talking about, even in like 71, 72. It's fascinating to hear that these are direct, like to think that Crass, possibly the first actual real punk band in our modern understanding, is a direct extension of the peace movement and the hippie movement. And really like diving deep into first wave American punk. I mean, that's like, besides like the amorphous, undefinable nature of what links all these bands together sonically and philosophically, is just the notion that there is a straight, continuous line from hippiedom into what becomes punk. And like Aaron Comet Bus in, I think issue 53 or 55 or something, has a great Berkeley-centered issue that connects like everything on Telegraph Avenue with punk, the peace movement, underground publications in America, and comic books, and presents it as a single continuous tree that spreads through time. It's amazing.
Sure, I've got a copy of that somewhere. I'm going to have to go back and reread that because, yeah, that's like precisely my wheelhouse.
For sure, yeah. And that's really the beauty of any creative movement is like there's always going to be this pressure to kind of, accept a certain way of remembering or thinking about that movement. And like, if I had to pick like a single theme and fall through that is not relationship based or feelings based, it's that sort of ephemeral, fleeting nature of creative movements where something is happening, but it's undefined in this brief window, where a free space is cleared out and it's immediately followed by the urge to kind of define and simplify things so that you can talk about them in a certain way so that people know what you're talking about. And then you like lose 70% of the details that actually made it special and unique.
I think there's probably also a very real way in which like somebody like the Ramones was a reaction. There are these like street tough characters, was a reaction to that peace and love scene. So obviously there's just a lot of different factors. You use the term amorphous, which is a good way to describe like specifically that CBGB scene, the kind of scene that unites like Blondie and the Ramones and
without a doubt
the Dead Boys. And, But yeah, it's a really interesting connection, especially from a political standpoint, that, the core beliefs that drive a lot of the punk ethos and the hippies at least come from the same place.
Oh yes. So I met my now wife, Rachel, back in 2004 when we were coworkers working with people with disabilities. And in 2005, we started our thing. And very, very quickly, maybe even before we had a relationship, when we were just coworkers becoming friends, Rachel is somebody who's never, ever been punk, even for a minute in her life, who is also the punkest person I know. Who's like a true iconoclast and has this incredible bullshit filter. And one of the very first like personal jabs she made at me, like kind of changed the way I perceived my life at the time, where I was sort of explaining, when I was like, oh yeah, like there's all kinds of punk stuff going on here in town in Bloomington, Indiana. You're probably like aware of bits of it on the fringe because it overlaps with other kinds of music and stuff, but it's not the way you think of with whatever.
You mansplained punk to your future wife.
And well, a lot of it, as I remember being like in my mid-20s, was sort of like just talking about like potlucks, dumpster diving, food not bombs, bike workshops, all kinds of stuff like this. And then basically all Rachel said was, she listened in her now I'm a therapist way, but she listened and then she was like, oh yeah, they're just hippies. And I was like, no, but they're not hippies. And she's like, yes, they are.
And your world came crashing down in that moment.
It's the same thing. They're hippies. And that was it. And I was like, they are hippies.
I went to school in Santa Cruz, and that is like, along with Berkeley, that is the apex of that intersection between those two cultures in a beautiful, beautiful way.
For sure. There's a great Santa Cruz band, Yaphet Kotto, from the late 1990s. I love that band.
There were a lot of good hardcore bands coming out around the late 90s, early aughts out of Santa Cruz. Good Riddance is probably the most famous of that school. We haven't really spoken much about March. Did you continue to be in touch with the congressman towards the end of his life?
You bet. Okay, so the last time I got to see Congressman Lewis was like December 1st, 2019. We all flew out just for a day to New York City because
he had already made public that he was battling.
No, he had not. And this plays into the experience. So like I hadn't seen him in several months. And prior to that, like we had spent years and years, literally every week or every other week, meeting in some other city and basically being on an endless tour together for 5 years or something. So it had been a few months, and he and Andrew and I met back up because the New York City public schools were adopting all 3 March books, throughout their curriculum. And it was this big deal. But when I saw him, he looked skinny. And I remember saying something dumb, but, it's like, oh, I was like, Congressman, I was like, you look like you lost like 20 pounds or something. And I remember Andrew just giving me like the eyes, like, no, not right now. And I was like, uh-oh. And it was about a month after that he came out publicly with it. So I actually found out by checking the news with everyone else. And then it seemed very obvious, it seemed obvious in that instant that I read the news along with everyone else. And I realized how much I put my foot in my mouth and put him on the spot. But then the world shut down. We had plans, like I was going to take my kids up to go see him speak somewhere in northern Indiana, and he had to cancel because it was right after his diagnosis, and COVID was kicking up, but the world hadn't shut down yet. And so from that moment on, like January 2020 on, I realized that no matter what happened with Congressman Lewis's health and his life, that our relationship needed to change. And so we still like played a role in each other's lives, and we loved each other and we were friends, or actual friends. But I realized that like it was really kind of on me to shift the dynamic entirely into a friend dynamic. Congressman Lewis like gets lonely. He got lonely, and like a lot of people would sometimes just like not check in with him because they assumed that too many people were checking in with him. So like once a week I would just make sure I called him and we would talk for a while. And just talk about like normal mundane stuff. And I finally got to ask questions about his cats and everything, stuff that like I was always thinking about, like higher minded stuff, or, we were doing our work stuff together, and at a certain point around May or early June, it got harder and harder to get in touch with him because someone else had gained access to his phone, like a staffer who may not have his best interests in mind. And I completely lost direct contact with him as soon as this individual sort of commandeered his phone. And so it was very surreal and strange that, there were these moments during the beginning of the pandemic, like his last time he ever came out in public was during the massive, upheaval and the waves of protests in May and June 2020, when he was in DC, downtown, and just getting to like show my kids, these images that were coming in, and just, seeing like really as proof that he's in it to win it, and he's still out there even under his incredible circumstances. But the last at least 2 months of his life, I had no direct contact with him. And that was just a really sad, unfortunate thing.
Do you think that your kids, kind of throughout were aware of the gravitas and the importance of this person?
Yes. And a lot of that is, like Harper, my older kid, was born like the week I started working on March, was born in late 2011. And so their life was literally surrounded by images of protest and historical images of the movement and images of John Lewis for my kid's entire life. So it was probably around 2015 when, around 2015 sometime, when my kid was able to actually make connections that this person was not only somebody who I was going out into the real world to talk about this stuff with, but the ways in which that intersected with this mass push to fulfill multiracial democracy and this mass push to maintain white supremacy and racial inequality throughout the 2010s. But I think one of the biggest moments there was in 2016. I was just thinking about this morning, when Congressman Lewis led that congressional sit-in for gun control. And the Republicans had the C-SPAN feed cut, audio and video were cut. And so they were having to like on the spot, on the floor, like broadcast from their cell phones and iPads and stuff. Electricity was cut in some parts of the chamber. But that was one of these moments where, I made both of my kids come downstairs and really just watch what was happening in real time, and to be able to show like a direct, simple application of the principles that I had been talking with my older kid about through the pages of March, but to see it in person, mediated through the TV screen as something that was happening right this second was, I think, very impactful for my older kid.
The significance of him dying when he died was not lost on me, during that time period. But certainly he experienced Trump in a very real way, even more than most of us did. And I'm curious if in those, really, not that we're out of it, but, in those incredibly difficult years, whether he ever gave you any optimism that things will ultimately get better.
Yes. And this is where the public John Lewis was just simply who he was for the most part. He was a little bit funnier in private life and a little snarkier, but in general, like his sincerity and the kind of like gravity, like just the bombs he would drop occasionally, we were like, whoa, I'm in the presence of this man. Yes. Like whenever he would, like, if we would do a talk and somebody would ask a question that simply had to do with like thinking in the medium term and the long term about the arc of history and actually like, successfully defeating these forces of white supremacy and oppression, when he would talk to people about like, a lot of his go-to lines, he would be like, if you want to tell me that things haven't changed and they're not changing, come walk a mile in my shoes and I will show you change. And talk about like the arc of history being like the fact that this is not the struggle of even of a few months, a few years, but it's the struggle of a lifetime, of many lifetimes. He 100% believed that and would privately convey that in so many words to us in these moments. Like, it's where, he truly, like, from a very young age, like, as depicted in the pages of our work together, like, that kind of gravity and intensity was with him from like age 5 on. And a lot of times perseverance was like was his main thing when we were talking about issues. He's like, essentially like, I've seen this shit before. We're going to see it again. He wouldn't say shit though, but he's like, this is the kind of thing that is going to continue recurring. And we as a people are going to continue to need to remain vigilant and rise to the occasion. Like it is not something that is solved once. The way of solving issues like this is continually addressing them and solving them. And for me, that's like, it's such a realistic, unromantic way that has no platitudes in it, that is also not depressing. It's like, it's the only way forward. And so his like actual hope in humanity, and hope in, like a movement that surpasses our own lifetimes, is something that was so necessary to hear, and so necessary to hear privately.
Let's quit this talk about the good days, and it's all I know sometimes to let go.